Today, I'm going to talk about the experience that I had recently of fulfilling a lifelong dream. It was the privilege, the honour of being invited to join the judging panel for the single most prestigious and celebrated wildlife photography competition on earth, the incomparable Wildlife Photographer of the Year. To make this video more enlightening and hopefully eye-opening, the only images that I'm going to share in this video today are ones that I've actually entered into this competition myself over the last 15 years or so. This way, you'll get a unique and transparent insight into the kind of images that professionals like me might choose to enter from the tens of thousands of images that I produce every year. You'll see firsthand the standard of some of my stronger images that didn't make it to the shortlist or award stage, contrasted against some of my weaker images that did, and vice versa. This way, hopefully, I'll reinforce the importance and the unpredictability of the subjectivity that is at the very core of photography. This subjectivity is at play whether we are capturing images ourselves or viewing and scrutinising the work of others. The images will all be captioned in three very self-explanatory ways. That is, entered, marked in red, and including the year or years that I entered it, because sometimes I might enter an image twice. This is where, however dramatic, compelling, or unusual the image, it was rejected at the very first stage. It is this category that burns, frustrates, and disappoints the most, but it is fascinating nonetheless. The second category, marked in amber and again always surprising, is for the shortlisted entries where one or more of my images reached the top 10% of the competition. At this stage, the judges see enough in the images to move them to the final round, so that they can compare them alongside the other shortlisted images. It is at this stage that WPY will request the raw file. In the end, however, the images marked as shortlisted in this video, of which you'll only see a small percentage, ultimately fell at the final hurdle, agonisingly short, as these harriers did twice in both 2019 and 2024. The final Holy Grail category, marked in green, is for those select images that actually end up getting awarded. But to see those images in full and to hear my honest, unfiltered thoughts on each one, you'll need to watch until the end of this video. Some of my choices, of course, will surprise you. Some might shock or amuse, and some will inevitably disappoint or even mystify you. But my intention with this channel, as always, is to share my knowledge and my experience openly, without ego or artifice, in the hope that in doing so, I might be able to help you with your own photography. To do that effectively, I must do it with absolute transparency, even if I do feel that some of my selections were debatable at best. In this video, I also want to share with you what I was personally looking for as a judge, and how my bias, my photographic preferences have been shaped by who I fundamentally am, how I was raised, my photographic and moral influences, and what I want my photography to ultimately achieve. All of this is incredibly important in determining what I was uniquely looking for, and how that, occasionally, contrasted starkly with the preferences of the other judges. I want to share with you what I personally learned from the experience, and what often unnecessary mistakes I felt that some of those who entered made, so that those of you watching won't make the same mistakes. This way, I'm hoping that I can not only encourage you to maybe take the plunge and enter your own images in future, but that my advice could actually make your chances of success just a little bit higher. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Andy Parkinson. I'm a National Geographic photographer, a Nikon Europe Ambassador, and today we are talking about Wildlife Photographer of the Year, or as I'm going to refer to it for the rest of this video, WPY. The first thing to say, and I think that this is a vitally important attribute for any competition, is that as a member of the jury, I looked at, evaluated and scored every single one of the record-breaking 60,000 plus images that were entered into WPY this year. Yes, this was a massive undertaking, daunting at times, and it took an inordinate amount of time. But for any competition to be credible, I personally believe that every judge should see every single image entered. But this is surprisingly not always the case with most other competitions. In some that I've judged previously, judges at the very first stage might only be allocated a few categories each, ultimately seeing and scrutinising only a percentage of the total images entered. This way, I've had to rely significantly on the initial image selections of the other judges, with whom I would have inevitably disagreed. But this is not the case with WPY. As I said, I looked at, scored, scrutinised every single image that was entered, as did the other judges, and this is very important to remember. So let's talk first about my process, and whilst I do, then here is a breakdown of the total number of images entered into every category. I'm also including the approximate number of images that I and every other judge had to try and whittle our choices down to as we made our initial selections individually at home. In the end, our collective choices amounted to approximately 6,000 images that reached the final round. So if you did enter and one or more of your images reached this stage, then you made it into the top 10% of all entries received. My personal approach was that, firstly, I marked all the images in a particular category as a no. I would then click through them one by one, looking for the select few images that I could mark either as a maybe or those far rarer images that I could mark as an immediate yes. If I was in any doubt at all, even if I paused to question how I felt about an image, then it would always be put into the maybe pile. That way I could come back to it later and assess it in direct comparison with the other maybes and even the yeses. The sheer number of images at this stage was mind-boggling, with almost 11,000 entered into both animal portraits and animals and their environment. And I had to get these numbers down to approximately 165 in each category, so you can imagine how ruthless I was having to be. Even so, by the end, it might surprise you to learn that I only actually put through about 125 images in each of those two most popular categories. Why? Simply because of the pedestal that I've always put WPY on, and the extremely high bar that I was looking for as a judge. As I've said previously, honesty and integrity are everything to me, and I will always speak with absolute transparency. So when I say that entering WPY has always been the most important and anticipated part of my photographic year, then I mean it 100%. Even in those years where perhaps I felt that I had fewer images at what I considered to be the required standard, I would enter anyway, no matter what, just in case. And I always enter the maximum number of images allowed. So that is top tip number 1. I've actually entered WPY every year since about 2002 without fail, and I will enter it every year going forward. The only reason I'm not able to share images that I entered before 2009 is simply because I am an occasional imbecile. I do have those images somewhere, but they are temporarily misplaced, hidden away somewhere on one of my many external hard drives that clutter the teenage nightmare that is my office. So those images will have to wait for a future video, and when I finally do find them, though this very old otter image was probably one that I entered, as was this very early grass snake, both captured in 2007, about 18 months after my rather belated transition to digital camera technology. So that's just me. I've always loved entering competitions, and I love the buzz of the hope, the anticipation, even though almost without exception it ultimately ends in disappointment. And this is very important to remember. It does not matter how much the image means to me, or how astonishing or unique the moment was when I captured it, like with these mountain hares touching noses. It doesn't even matter how it might reflect a once-in-a-lifetime moment, something that I've never personally witnessed before, or that it's one of my all-time favourite images. If it doesn't connect with or speak to the judges that year, then that's it. Out of interest, despite being rejected in 2019, in 2023, this image managed to get shortlisted for the People's Choice Award. This truly is the last chance saloon where, despite missing out on the top 100 awarded images, the next 25 favoured images get put forward to a public vote. Of these, the top 5 do end up being officially awarded. The odds of success in People's Choice then are good, effectively 1 in 5. But alas, despite this final reprieve, the public gravitated towards 5 other images more. All, of course, were richly deserving. It also doesn't matter if I'm immediately excited after I capture a particular image, like with this mallard duckling running to catch up with its family. How much I might think, ooh, that's definitely a WPY image, convincing myself of all the boxes that it might tick. Compelling effect in the motion blur, stunning late light, a wing-shaped insect trail, or a familiar subject photographed a different way. Over the years, I've become an expert in building up my hopes, almost to the point of becoming expectations, so please try to avoid falling into this trap. Granted, there is, however, almost an inevitability to attaching one's hopes to a single image or series. The false confidence of maybe feeling like you've cracked it, that this might be the image. This is all completely natural and predictable, but not particularly helpful because, put simply, it still doesn't count for anything. In reality, I've lost count of the times that I've captured an image and thought, yes, this time, only to get the email months later that says, actually no, not this time. So remember, expectation usually precedes disappointment, so try to manage your own. Hopefully, this video will assist in that process. Take this brown hair as a perfect example. I mean, it looks like it's got an actual walking stick. In reality, it was just shaking the snow off its paws, close to where a single stick was poking out of the snow. I couldn't believe the extraordinary luck that I'd had when I captured it, but I've entered it twice and it's never even been shortlisted. Why? Because I'd likely become so tunnel-visioned about the experience and obsessively focused on its one strength that I overlooked its obvious weaknesses. When I proudly emailed it to my good friend, the curmudgeonly Scottish wildlife photographer Pete Cairns, his first, typically unfiltered response was, well, it's a shame that the hair's facing slightly away. Thanks, Pete. So remember, when I was judging that initial stage, I was looking rigorously for flaws, for reasons why I could reject an image. So overwhelmed was I by the sheer scale of the task at hand. Flaws, of course, are fine, as long as there are enough other qualities in the image to compensate. So this is an important consideration before entering. Remember, if you can easily identify the flaw in your image, then so can the judges. Like with this snaggle-toothed bear, who would look a lot more relaxed if he didn't have an entire tooth outside of his mouth. On reflection, over the course of my 25-year career, then no is the word that I've heard most often. No from grouchy fellow photographers, from picture libraries and agencies, and from magazine publishers and competition judges, and now often from social media audiences. But this routine photographic rejection has never and will never stop me, nor in any way diminish my love for photography, and nor should it you. For me, any rejection is easily contextualised by the privilege and time spent in the company of our wild cousins, studiously watching and learning as their lives unfold, witnessing the infinitely greater challenges that they have to endure daily just to survive, to protect and raise their precious offspring, the bonds that they inevitably share, and the genuinely complex emotions that we now know unequivocally that they experience, just like us. The context that this quiet observation has always offered me in my life has been invaluable, always putting into immediate perspective any disappointment that I have to routinely face. As a result, I've always felt able to bounce back from my career disappointments, always having learned, refined and hopefully improved. This way I have the ability to keep going again and again and again. So I know as much as anyone else the burning sense of rejection, the disappointment of finally receiving that dreaded email, the one that says, "Thanks, but not this year." This is an email that I have received on 21 out of the 24 years that I have entered WPY, and that, for anyone who might be interested, is an 87.5 failure rate for me personally in WPY. The point of this reflection is simply to illustrate that I took my judging responsibilities incredibly seriously and with absolute diligence and respect for the work I was charged with assessing. I knew that my decisions, that I was often making in mere seconds, would and could likely disappoint, dismay and even devastate thousands of people, passionate photographers just like me. I was also acutely aware that what I was scrutinising was often the proudest achievement in an entire photographic year, maybe even a lifetime. Often incredibly beautiful, technically complete images for which the photographer should be rightly proud and with which they shared an understandable emotional attachment. Images that they believed in, of a moment that they will likely cherish and remember for the rest of their lives. I got to see time and again the passion that people who had entered had for a particular image or series, as they'd often choose to enter the same image twice in both colour and in black and white, as I did previously with these Kamchatka bare feet. In this instance, neither image even got past the first stage, even though I've always loved and believed in the uniqueness of the images and how the bubbling water of a mountain river, rendered mist-like by a 1-second exposure, ran between the unmanicured claws of the stoically persistent bear. Sticking with the same species and at the same location, but this time a confiding adult, contemplatively chilling on a nearby rock, the colour image again failed to sufficiently impress or engage the judges, falling at the first hurdle. The black and white version, however, fared a little better, deemed to have enough quality to get shortlisted, but alas, no further. So what do you guys think? Which were your favourites out of those two sets of images, colour or black and white? And more importantly, was I wasting my time? Or might you have believed in them enough to enter them? You see, I know that feeling of disappointment because I have lived it, I felt it and it hurts, but in reality, only for the briefest of times. It is at this critical moment where and why we must remember the inherently subjective nature of wildlife photography. It is not like maths or physics, where there is a definitive right or wrong. With wildlife photography, it is only ever about opinion, and how that opinion is arrived at is dependent on myriad unknown variables. I was just one voice in 7 on that jury. And it didn't matter how much I loved, was awed by, or even beguiled by the astonishing beauty of an image. If the other judges didn't feel the same way, despite my quite pathetic pleading, or the nature of their careers understandably saw them prioritising other qualities, then the image would inevitably be rejected. This was, of course, a burning frustration for me, but I had to respect their opinions and their decisions, just as I knew that they would respect mine. My individual career, one that is of course completely unique to me, has been one of largely trying to capture beautiful, intimate moments in the lives of animals and birds, like these swans photographed less than 2 miles from my home. I have no qualms in admitting, a self-confessed pretty picture taker, though hopefully, as you look through the wide variety of images throughout this video, you will see that my photographic passions and my abilities do stretch well beyond the confines of simply pretty pictures. And this seems like an appropriate place to pause and tell you about the Patreon page that I've just set up, the link for which will be in the description below. In short, this is an opportunity for you to see my newest, strongest images on the day that they're processed, often a full 12 to 18 months before they'll be released publicly. You'll get to see what new images I'm genuinely excited by and why, what competitions I'm about to enter, and with what images. You'll also get all kinds of other unique, unseen insights into my work, as well as detailed explanations and tech specs. If you'd like to learn more about this opportunity, then please do hit the link in the description, which will tell you everything that you need to know. So let's get back to WPY. So for me, right from the start of the judging process, the number one criterion that I was looking for was impact, but with an additional weight given to originality, narrative, and ethical practice. I wanted the image to stop me in my tracks. I wanted it to be immediately compelling, visually complete, but I am not and have never been species driven. It is the quality of the image, not the rarity of the subject, that appeals most to me. Even before I was a professional wildlife photographer, I grew up astonished by the images of my uncle, wildlife photographer Rick Packwood. Rick spent huge parts of the 70s and 80s travelling, exploring and photographing largely in East Africa, and particularly in the Mara Serengeti ecosystem. It was his extraordinary slideshows during my formative years that either unearthed in me an innate affinity with the art of photography or, more likely, forged an entirely new passion into my young mind. It taught me not only the power of a well-crafted image, the feeling of awe that it can elicit, but also about the transformative effect, the importance of composition. How even a relatively mundane subject photographed beautifully with creativity and imagination could still become utterly compelling, even mesmerising. Rick actually won 2 categories in the early years of WPY, and as recently as 2013 he won the black and white category, so this is a competition that I have known about and have venerated for almost my entire life. So when I sat in my office at home, poring diligently through those first 60,000 images, I was looking for images that I felt were worthy of the accolade. I was looking essentially for WPY standard images, images that I felt reached a unique and very particular benchmark, but equally, I want you to realise just how achievable that benchmark is. I'm privileged to run photographic safaris all over the world, and there's a link to my mailing list which will be in the description below. And the number of my guests that routinely produce images that I know are WPY standard is staggeringly high. And this touches on what I think is likely the biggest misconception, the biggest inaccuracy about WPY that I hear from people time and again, and that is that the majority of images entered have been captured by some of the leading professional photographers around the world, and that every one of them is working with unique and privileged access on multi-million-dollar assignments for some of the biggest publications. I want to dispel that myth straight away, as this is simply not the case. In my experience, I would say that the standard of images entered is far more varied, with all manner of abilities and styles represented. Remember, photography is a great leveller, and most enthusiastic photographers out there have some exceptional images hidden away that perhaps they lack the confidence to share. I want you to have the confidence to share your work, to take that chance, and there is no bigger, no better platform than WPY. So the first obstacle, the first Rubicon that you need to cross is to enter it in the first place. To gain the confidence to do that, to take that leap of faith, then I would suggest that first you pour through some of the awarded images from previous years. The link will appear on screen here, and it will also be in the description below. The subjective nature of photography means that I can absolutely guarantee you that you will stumble upon a great many images whose inclusion in the final 100 will leave you absolutely mystified. This is inevitable, and every year I'm utterly perplexed by some of the judges' choices, as some of you no doubt will be by some of our choices when you see them for the first time this coming October, again with the subjectivity. Over the years, I've been privileged to have attended the award ceremony at London's Natural History Museum on maybe 10 occasions, and not once sitting in that audience have I ever agreed with the final choice of overall winner. That is when scrutinising all of the 12 category winners eligible for the grand prize. That's not to say that the overall winners weren't deserving, or that they weren't astonishing images, but simply because there were other images, other category winners in the competition that year that my eye was drawn to more, what I, as a photographer, favour. It is these images that you need to keep front and centre in your mind, the ones that make you think, well, I could take a better image than that, or, well, I've got better images than that sitting on my hard drive. Exactly. So get them off your hard drive and get them entered, because then at least you will have a chance, which you won't if you never enter them in the first place. But please, before you do enter, it is vital for you to read the rules first. The number of images that I had to reject immediately for obvious and unnecessary breaches of the rules likely ran into several hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 images. So let's look first at those avoidable errors, so that when you do enter, the judges can at least have the pleasure of actually scrutinising your hard-earned images, as opposed to being compelled to reject them immediately. Most importantly, in all competitions that are judged fairly and impartially, is ruthlessly maintaining the photographer's anonymity. This is absolutely vital, and so you absolutely cannot have your name emblazoned across any part of the image, or in the image caption that you provide. Images that have these are immediately discarded by the judges, no matter how good they are. And yes, I had to reject images that would have been good enough to be shortlisted, simply because they had the photographer's watermark on them. I understand that many people like to watermark their images before they put them on social media in order to protect them, though it's not something that I do myself. But these images cannot be entered into the competition, so please prepare some new JPEGs prior to submitting. The same automatic rejection occurs for any image with a border around it, however much you might think that it makes your image stand out. Next up, I want to talk about post-processing and the importance of doing this carefully, sympathetically and authentically. Again, it does not matter how outstanding the image is. If it has been compromised by the processing, then we had no choice but to reject it. Images always have to be judged as seen, and as frustrating as it can be for the judges, we can't go back to the photographer in the moment and say, look, just calm down the saturation a bit on this, or just correct the colour balance a little, or maybe just employ a fraction less contrast. Fortunately and justly, the competition will now reach out to these select photographers who have perhaps made these trivial but consequential errors at a later date after this final stage forced omission. Here, the competition organisers will be able to articulate some of the judges' concerns with a view to the photographer potentially resubmitting the image in the following years if they choose. And yes, this honourable and earnest approach has already worked out for some photographers who ultimately ended up getting those images awarded after resubmitting another year. Sticking on the topic of dubious processing, it seems that with every new incarnation of Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom, there are new tools with which photographers seem to be getting a little too carried away. One of the most recent and most significant culprits, and I have been guilty of this myself, is utilising Select Subject, here illustrated with the opening image of Bengal tigers fighting, or the Select Background tool. These powerful tools can be incredibly effective and useful for making subtle changes to specific aspects of a frame. But time and time again we were seeing overuse. So let's explore. This is my current favourite process version of the tigers fighting. All parts of the frame are authentic and real, and there remains detail, even small distractions in the background. Contrast this image with this one, where the darkening and dehazing of the background has, I believe, gone way too far. Almost all of the background detail has been lost, and the tigers, though dramatically isolated in the frame, are starting to look unnatural, photoshopped. Similarly with this image of two Kamchatka bear cubs appearing to dance. Again, a completely authentic image, but processed to try and calm down some annoying background hotspots. Of course, the image would have been improved had I been able to throw the messy, cluttered backdrop further out of focus, but working in the presence of protective mama bears requires an especially calm and unobtrusive approach. Contrast that with this next overly processed version, where I've selected just the background, the problematic part of the image, and reduced both clarity and texture. Whilst it has undeniably made the backdrop less distracting, and to many people potentially improved the image, both the water droplets and the foreground have started to look inauthentic and unnatural. The kind of weird effect that piques a judge's suspicions. Speaking personally, not on behalf of the competition, I believe that this second image has again gone too far, and the adjustments made have compromised not only the authenticity of the original image, but also the authenticity of what we as photographers can potentially encounter, and what effects we can naturally create with our lenses. The same issues can be found with the Select Subject tool, and as a rather salient example, I've recently seen some images by someone that I'd consider to be one of the finest wildlife photographers on earth that I personally think look absolutely ridiculous. So my advice is, when processing your images, try not to stray too far from the original raw file, like with this natural looking Nile monitor peering down from a tree. Overusing powerful tools like Select Subject can make the subject in images look absurdly isolated, like with this clumsily processed version of the same image. This time the lizard is overly brightened, glowing serenely in the frame. In an age of rapidly developing AI, producing images that remain natural and authentic will always serve you better. Trust me. By all means, use all available processing tools to produce sympathetic, subtle improvements, but leave it there. Ultimately, the image should remain visually natural and authentic, but increasingly as judges, we were occasionally seeing unreal, artificial-looking images. Detailed checks on the raw files usually confirmed our suspicions, and the image would ultimately be rejected. And please also tread carefully with vignettes. If you want your images to look like you photographed the subject through vegetated surroundings, then frame your subject carefully through vegetated surroundings. Don't simply add a clumsy, egg-shaped vignette in post-processing, as it usually looks naff and serves only to detract from your image. It's worth noting, however, that sometimes, with certain lenses and in particular environmental conditions, that more natural-looking vignettes can inadvertently be produced. This is what happened here with this grebe image as it emerged from the fog into dawn sunlight. Another really important thing to remember when entering very specifically WPY is that whilst you can remove dust marks or sensor spots, you cannot remove any other distraction or flaw from the image at all, no matter how annoying or inconsequential it might appear. This fox image, one of my all-time favourites, is maddeningly compromised by the tiny pocket of daylight penetrating through from the other side of this small woodland. Removing it appears relatively inconsequential and greatly improves the image, but such an alteration would result in immediate disqualification of the image. And yes, again this year, whilst judging, images that were going to be awarded had to be disqualified at the raw check stage simply for minor and often pointless breaches of important rules. My honest piece of advice here would be to just avoid these kinds of alterations completely. Mark Twain famously said that if you tell the truth, then you don't have to remember anything. And whilst there is absolutely nothing wrong with removing anything that you choose from your own images, an issue could arise if you forget and then enter that image into a competition. This is just because fundamentally you'll have to remember every alteration, every bit of cloning made to every image. Much better, I believe, just to leave as is and accept whatever flaws exist as an integral part of the experience, like this wing-clipped black-headed gull. Something to learn from, to try and improve on, and to pay more attention to when framing future images. But of course, you must forge your own path. And just a quick reminder that subscribing is always free and it's the very best way to support my content here on YouTube. Just 25% of my viewers do currently subscribe, so if you don't already, then please do consider hitting the red button below. Thank you. One really important piece of advice here, and one that I swear by, especially with images that I'm enthusiastic about, is to process the image multiple times, producing distinct versions as you do so. I typically do this on separate days and in different moods, and then I gather those 3 or 4 versions together in a sequence before flicking through them one by one. As I do so, one version will invariably stand out, usually the one that I think is most appropriately, accurately and sympathetically processed. This will hopefully give you pointers as to which image has perhaps been a little over or under processed, or which one has perhaps a slight colour cast. And believe me when I say this, even now I can look back at images that I've processed very recently and be amazed at just how badly I've done it. So take your time, keep in mind the light and the setting of when you originally captured it, and try to encapsulate that authenticity as much as you possibly can. But remember, you will make mistakes, so just accept them as part of the journey, part of the process, and move forward. Again, with some competitions, not WPY, there is, in my opinion, far too much latitude when it comes to processing. And again, I say this directly from what I have seen. Images that I have thrown out of some competitions because of substantial amounts of cloning have then magically appeared in other internationally renowned competitions. Even one where I know that the raw files have allegedly been requested and scrutinised. The next subject that I want to touch on is the thorny and often controversial issue of baiting, where a bird or mammal is fed, allowing the photographer either an artificially close proximity or access to a particular feeding behaviour. Well-known examples that appear readily on social media are species like the Dalmatian pelicans of Lake Kokini, gannets diving for discarded fish in the UK, Arctic foxes approaching for food in Iceland, or golden and white-tailed eagles in Scandinavia, or indeed the great many images that you see of bears and wolves in places like Finland. All of these species are being artificially fed, solely to create photographic opportunities, so I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts on this matter. Another example would be this image of an unnaturally large gathering of red kites captured at Gigrin Farm in mid-Wales, a supplementary feeding site credited with playing a massive role in the recovery and protection of this once critically endangered raptor. As judges, we understood that baiting is an extremely wide and variable subject, with all manner of ethical complications and considerations. It is not a one-size-fits-all subject. Take this redwing image as an example. These birds had gathered naturally to feast on the many windfall apples in my neighbour's snow-covered garden. All I did was swap a few grubby, rotten, unsightly apples for some shop-bought but altogether overly red apples. In essence, I hadn't moderated the redwing's behaviour one iota. Rather, I simply added in a more photogenic food source. So should this still count as baiting? I think yes, but again, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Trigger warning on the next image. For many years now, WPY has rightly abhorred and banned the practice of live baiting, where live animals are effectively sacrificed to habituated predators. This usually takes the form of live mice or lemmings, their limbs broken, being thrown to various owl species, or kingfishers diving into and explosively emerging from submerged fish tanks. And yes, you're right to trust your gut instinct. Your immediate reaction when learning about this grubby practice for the first time was absolutely right. For other baiting, however, with something innocuous like birdseed, WPY clearly states in their rules that they favour non-baited images. However, I believe, rightly, that WPY are effectively moving toward a zero baiting approach, seeking out only completely natural, unmanipulated aspects of behaviour. This was effectively our approach as judges this year. Some images were rejected because the location meant it was obvious that baiting had occurred. On other occasions, we sought clarification from photographers and were heartened by the honesty and integrity of their responses. If baiting was used, however, then ultimately, even though we did appreciate the candour of their responses, the image was not awarded. The whole judging process was incredibly enlightening for me, and this is why I wanted to do this video, even though, as my wife suggests, it might be a bit niche. There were just so many fascinating aspects of the process that I wanted to share. The fact that we as judges review and reflected on our decisions constantly, revisiting images that we'd already seen many times. It is then that some of these images come to the fore, and it was 3 of these revisited images that went on to become category winners, and one almost won the whole thing. Overall, from the final 150 or so images that we'd condensed the 60,000 down to, we lost an additional 14 of those to raw file checks. In essence, your images will be revisited time and time again, and they will have every chance to shine. And even though we went through the entire judging process and selected the winners, as judges we never got to know the photographers' identities, even when our decisions were finalised. We'll only find out their names in October at the same time as you. And as we were looking through portfolios, even if the first few images were not strong enough to be awarded, we still looked at and scrutinised every single image in every single portfolio. The main takeaway for me from the whole experience is that there has never been a better time to enter WPY. Print media is facing massive budgetary challenges, and we are seeing the dawn of a new photographic era. Assignments, if they are allocated at all, are smaller, shorter, and much less immersive, and with much less privileged access. The playing field is levelling, and the opportunity for you to shine is growing. In a world increasingly filled with social media photographers, dipping into species for little more than a day or two, the time is right for you to immerse yourself, to commit, to explore and to innovate. Avoid photographic homogeny, easily identifiable locations where legions of photographers have been before. Find your own unique local stories, no matter how mundane or familiar the species. Originality is everything, so show the judges something unfamiliar, something that piques their interest. And write a passionate, informative and detailed caption, as this will only add weight to your image, to the story, and it does provide an invaluable extra element of context for the judges. Prioritise as well the undersubscribed categories like urban wildlife. Given that 55% of the global population live in urban areas, and there are always animals and birds with which we share these spaces, I would definitely recommend working on identifying and creating stories, exploring the fascinating and often polarising nature of our relationships with our urban cousins. Though I rightly consider myself a wildlife photographer, I have been known on occasion to enter another undersubscribed category, that is plants and fungi, with this image of a rewilded limestone pavement in Yorkshire, photographed on a commission shortlisted in 2022. Or, depending on your photographic preferences, your favoured work might focus more on photojournalism, which is again another massively undersubscribed category. I know that I lack the courage and mental fortitude to witness the horror that remarkable photojournalists like Joanne MacArthur and Paul Hilton subject themselves to tell critically important stories. But maybe you have what it takes to make a real difference. Though I do perhaps regret having never entered this particular gannet image into WPY, photographed on assignment for National Geographic magazine. At this late stage, however, the 5-year time limit on images has long since passed. If you do happen to enter the portfolio category, then try to enter more than 6 images. This way, the judges can select the images that they connect with the most. If you only enter 6 and 1 is weak, then the whole portfolio will lose out because of that one weak image. So now let's finally get to the 4 awarded images that I've had in WPY over the last 22 years. And my emotions about these images are somewhat contradictory. Speaking honestly, I consider myself both lucky to have had as many as 4, but equally, I feel a little unlucky not to have had more. One of the biggest issues that I've always had, or that I believe that I've had, is the sheer number of images that I produce every year. Trying to condense those down to just 25 over the course of an entire year has always been incredibly difficult. But my WPY duck was finally broken in 2010 when I had 2 images awarded. The first one was this vertiginous image of a fulmar hanging with consummate ease on surging updrafts. It was an undeniably perilous image to capture as I leant out over the precipitous cliff edge to try and eliminate the messy foreground. The moment of luck required appeared in the form of an additional surge in the wind. This puffed out both the bird's tail feathers but also its legs. My regret with this image is that I didn't have access to a wider lens to expand the perspective and to make the drop look even higher. My second awarded image that year was both pioneering and polarising. The idea of using a slow exposure technique to reveal the movement in the gannet's flight paths has long been copied in the years since, but I still think that they chose the wrong image. I much prefer this one. It is more simple, more graphic, and the flight paths of the gannets more visually appealing, to me at least. As always, however, I'd love to hear your thoughts about your preferences. It was only years later when I revisited the original images that I found this one that I'd completely overlooked. Of the 3, this is now my clear favourite, simply because of the scale that it conveys. But when I belatedly entered it in 2018, before the 5-year time limit was introduced, the ship had long since sailed for what is now considered old hat. It was to be another 6 years before I would get lucky again, and this time I left the Scottish mountains with this image, or at least this encounter, at the forefront of my hopes. It felt different, unusual, the air filled with blowing spindrift made sharp by the closed down aperture. The hair, framed with a wide lens, was relaxed by my hypothermic investment of time, and accepted happily my clumsy, knee-high approach. For a moment at least, pay attention to the ice field that forms the backdrop. It will reappear in 2 images' time. Of the 2 from this sequence, it was this one that the judges favoured. My photographic approach was different. This time the aperture was left wide open at f4.5, focusing the viewer's attention more on the hair. But in a year where I concentrated mainly on gannets, swans and hares, I needed some other images from my time in Scotland's winter mountains. I finally settled on this one, found during a cursory rummage through my recent hair files, effectively an afterthought that I named with a cliché, "Three's a crowd." Of course, it was this one that landed. Over time, I have come to agree with the judge's decision, and of the 3 images, I feel that this is the most complete. The narrative, one that attests to the bleak hardship of their herbivorous existence, is achieved with more subtlety, but the purpose of the image remains the same. The final image takes a sledgehammer to that subtlety and shows a hare up close, enduring the absolute ferocity that a Scottish winter can deliver, nibbling desperately on its own faeces as it ekes out its relentlessly perilous existence. Initially rejected from the original 100, it got its reprieve in the People's Choice category and has gone on to be not only my most successful image, but so far, arguably the one that has defined my career. It is Hairball. Again, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and it's given you a few insights into WPY. As always, subscribing is the very best way to support my content and it would be so appreciated. And by all means, please do check out my Patreon page. But for now, I promise you it won't be too long till the next video comes out. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.